A lot of landlords out there are accidental landlords. There's been talks over the last 2 days about basically the UK having to get bailed out. The debt is spiraling unless Rachel Reeves can stun the whole.
There's also talks of Rachel Reeves bringing in exit stamp duty for property owners.
We're not growing as a country. Taxing their way out of this isn't going to work. We have to stop a very leaky bucket, which I think the government have at the moment.
Wealthy people in the UK that own real estate, that might be the only thing holding them into the UK.
Landlord bashing is so prevalent in the UK.
And they're also talking about potentially taxing if you leave the UK.
The queue for rental properties is way more than the actual supply at the moment, hence why things have absolutely astronomically escalated.
If you're in property investment, I think it's a really good opportunity to be buying at the moment. It's a buyer's market already.
94% of landlords only have one property. If you've been tuning into the news this week, you couldn't have missed, or if you're a landlord anyway, Rachel Reeves and her wisdom is looking to also charge landlords more tax by hitting us with national insurance payments. That'll be 8%, I think, on rental income. Now, for those that haven't held property in property name, in your own personal name, since 2017, 2018, they brought in Section 24 tax, which effectively is a tax on revenue, not tax on profit, which I don't know any other business or any other occasion where that is the case, where essentially you are taxed on everything you generate in revenue rather than actually taxed on what's left behind after mortgage payments and things like that. So basically they stopped you having the ability to offset your mortgage payments against the rental income, which is massive, and why a lot of landlords ported their portfolios over to a corporate sort of limited company structure to kind of avoid that tax, which is massive, to be honest. I've only got one property in my personal name now. It's something that I owned very early on, lived in for a little bit, and then effectively, didn't become an accidental landlord, but a lot of landlords out there are accidental landlords, where they've owned a property, they've moved to a new one, they've kept the existing one as, potential pension pot going forward and to help rental stock within the industry. The drawbacks of that in my personal name is that ultimately the asset that I own makes no money, every month. It's pretty much running at a loss because I'm paying tax on the total amount of revenue, not the actual profit I'm making within it, which makes no sense. But ultimately, I don't want to sell it at the moment. There's drawbacks to doing so. They'll get you with capital gains tax when I sell, and it's a difficult position for landlords that own property in their personal name. And ultimately, this is another tax on unearned income. It's not actually profit that is being taxed. It's taxed on absolutely everything. And it's a real shit show. And to be honest, I'm really, really worried around the whole UK economy at the moment. There's been talks over the last 2 days about basically the UK having to get bailed out. The debt is spiraling unless Rachel Reeves can stun the whole. We're not going to get anywhere. And ultimately taxing their way out of this isn't going to work. We have to stop a very, very leaky bucket, which I think the government have at the moment, which is leaking money left, right and centre on unnecessary costs, on inefficiency being the main one. Ultimately, until that leaky bucket is plugged, we're not going to win at all. There's no instigation for growth. We're not growing as a country, and all of these tax hikes are not going to help that growth. So we're on a downward spiral, and I'm not really sure where it's going to end up, but this is another tax raid on landlords. Landlord bashing is so prevalent in the UK, and it's a shame because I think last time I checked, about 28% of the housing stock is rental property. It needs to be more than that because there is a demand for that level of housing, and ultimately the private rental sector is a massive part of that. The government do not have the cash or the resources to generate enough social housing to cater for the ever-growing list of social housing requirements and needs. The private rental sector is still a must. And I've seen a lot of HMO landlord bashing recently. Obviously, people think that generally the only people living in those HMOs is asylum seekers. If I didn't have a bedsit and a shared house to live in after uni, I'm not sure what I would have done. I wouldn't have been able to afford a one-bedroom flat on my own. Living in a shared house gave me absolutely, amazing friends and a social life that was absolutely fantastic to come out of as a young professional after university. And ultimately, people want to live in shared houses, and there is a requirement and a need for it in the UK. So we need to have HMOs. And I think the standard of HMOs that we see across our social media, with obviously the contacts that we have and the people in the industry are doing fantastic things with private HMOs. And I think ultimately most people just see HMOs as skanky old places with mold-ridden, rat infestation and 4 people in a room. And there are landlords out there that are doing that, and that's unfortunate, but ultimately that is the very few spoiling it for the many, in my opinion. So this is just a further squeeze on private landlords, which is just, I don't think isn't going to help anyone. If they're bringing those houses back into the housing market, that might be good for people that might be able to buy them. But ultimately, it means there's a massive hole for rental properties. And we know that the queue for rental properties is way more than the actual supply at the moment, hence why things have absolutely astronomically escalated over the last couple of years in terms of rental costs. And that isn't going to slow down if the number of rental properties available reduces. Jack, any thoughts?
Love the podcast and all the information you both share. I've just started listening to them all from the start after hearing a couple of them getting hooked. Such valuable information. I do love your pod whilst driving with a cuppa site to site. Love the podcast. Very honest and informative. Listen every week now, and I'm working my way through all the previous ones. Keep them coming. This is the feedback we get from our Property Experts podcast. So if you haven't checked it out, you can go back to the live section on our YouTube channel where you can see all of the back catalogue, or if you prefer audio format, all of the video podcasts are put into audio format for Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So head over there and follow.
In addition to what Ben has mentioned, essentially, the way I like to look at it is very, very, very rarely a tax policy comes in and everyone accepts it, pays it, and then no activity is created off the back of that. And what I mean by that is if we have stamp duty holiday reliefs, the busiest time of the year will be to buy or sell those assets within that period. So what happens is taxation doesn't necessarily mean that they get a linear growth of tax income off the basis of what they're doing. What they do create is activity. There's thousands and thousands of existing landlords that own properties in their personal name. They've already been clobbered, as Ben mentioned, over the last few years. There's also talks of Rachel Reeves bringing in exit stamp duty for property owners. So the stamp duty is paid by the person exiting the property rather than the buyer buying the property. Now, if you think about it, these landlords that have potentially worked pretty hard to invest in a pension pot, which is real estate, they have paid stamp duty to buy the property. They're now getting taxed so much that there's probably no profit, if not negative equity. And equally, they might get taxed if they sell it at the tail end. So they have royally been pillaged. So why that they're hunkering down so much on the privately owned landlord space, I'm not really sure, because I think it will lead to landlords selling up. We've already had, I think 2022, 140,000 properties, rental properties, went onto the open market that were owned by landlords. And if you look at our housing target, which is 300,000 homes, you would like to think that a larger percentage of those 300,000 we need to produce every year will be rented. At the moment, we're having 140,000 back a couple of years ago that were rented, now going into the private ownership market where the debt isn't there to facilitate that. Then you look at proactivity. It's going to push everyone to owning properties into limited companies, which people are doing now anyway. So I don't think there's much tax benefit for the government in that position. So I think rents will go up significantly. I think it'll make it less affordable for people to get onto the housing ladder because rents have gone up. What happens if you're renting for X amount more, you can't afford to buy a property and save up for it. There'll be less private landlords and there'll be motivated landlords. So for you listeners, if you're in property investment, I think it's a really good opportunity to be buying at the moment. It's a buyer's market already. And I think that it's going to become more of a buyer's market in the investment space for investment properties. I can't see them earning more tax off this other than actually the transactional tax that they will generate, because landlords are commercially minded people. Very few people run a rental property for the passion. So they're commercially minded. So they will assess their finances and go, I'll take the equity out and I'll go and get a haircut like Rachel Reeves. They won't be sitting there waiting for the income anymore. So I think it's pretty silly. I think a lot of people in the UK think it's very silly. Maybe there's an angle of trying to actually drive more stamp duty income, because rather than charging 8% of rents, they're charging a flat fee of maybe a 2% or 3% surcharge on SDLT of the total value of the sale. That might be a thing. And maybe they're trying to push out unprofessional outfits that don't know how to manage properties properly. So they're sort of weeding people out to do it that way. But huge opportunity for buy-to-let and rental growth, huge opportunity for buying. Sucks for people that thought they had it all set up and they're just being taxed again. I think it's a real shame.
A lot of people will hold on to properties that they've maybe lived in for a while and, become an accidental landlord with one or two properties. Like, I think the figure is something like 94% of landlords only have one property, which is staggering, really. That's a lot of people that have just moved on, managed to afford to kind of to keep a previous property that they've once lived in, for example, and they see it more as their pension pot. And I think that idea of keeping property longer term as a hedge against pensions is dwindling. The wider landscape with pensions in the UK is fucked. It's not going to last. Like, pensions aren't what they used to be, and they're not going to be in the longer term. So by pillaging properties now from landlords at this point, and if they're having to sell now with the view that actually they're just going to rely on the state pension going forward, or, you know, private pensions that might have paid into over the longer term, those people are also going to be screwed. State pension isn't going to be able to cope with that additional load from, you know, people that don't have the property to live off as well. And I do think short term it's short-sighted, and longer term it's also an issue on the wider pension industry and schemes. So I think it's a real shit show. And yeah, we would be interested to know what you guys think down below, because it's scary times for the UK, and I think this is just another big problem that is not going to aid the growth and the stimulation of the economy one bit.
If you have wealthy people in the UK that own real estate, that might be the only thing holding them into the UK. They might have sold their business or retired or been successful in their careers. Most of these landlords own real estate in their own personal name, have probably bought them as investment over 15 years ago, because kind of in the last 10 to 15 years, people have kind of caught on to the value of having them in the limited company structure. Pre that, you've got these people that may actually say, well, I don't own any property there now. The tax is ridiculous. The inheritance tax is, ridiculous. And they might just bugger off. And they're also talking about potentially taxing if you leave the UK. We've had the most wealthy people in the UK leave the country. If you think about all of the non-exec advisors in the UK, they're all successful people that live in the UK. And we're losing them to foster the growth of the grassroots of the country. So it's just short-sighted, essentially.
If you got value from this video, make sure you click the subscribe button down below and ring the notification bell, because we release one video at least every week, so you'll be the first to get notified. See you on the next one.